Requiem Metal Podcast, Episode 21, Projections of a Stained Mind.
Welcome to the Requiem Metal Podcast. You just heard our opening number of this evening or morning, depending on when you're listening to us. That was Entombed, Forsaken, but obviously, Mark, a version that many people may not have heard. Tell us what we're listening to tonight.
This was the only... first of all, we're listening to the Projections of a Stained Mind comp, which is put out by CBR Records in 1991, I believe. Yeah. Which is kind of like a holy grail of Swedish Death Metal stuff. Really, a lot of the stuff was never released, or it's all different versions. Like this version of Forsaken, probably the one most of you guys have heard was on
the Crawl EP.
The Crawl EP that had Over Softstrom from Nirvana in 2002 on vocals, and this is the only version with LG Petrov.
Yeah, still current and original vocalist of Entombed. So, and Projections of Stained Mind is the second compilation that we've actually chosen to do for a podcast. The first was the War compilation, and Projections of Stained Mind has a sort of a just a particular nuance to it in that it has this sort of the who's who of all this great sort of early stages of Swedish rock.
Yeah, really.
Or Swedish metal or rock.
I mean, it's kind of the predecessor to the War Comp in a way. The same. They had the same kind of feeling when I got that as when I got the War Comp.
Well, now, would you say that this one, even though it doesn't completely fit geographically, this is sort of like the compilation of the Stockholm sound, whereas War Compilation is the Stockholm of the Gothenburg sound? I mean, is that a fair sort of assessment?
Yeah, we've got. Mayhem's on here, and from far away, and then Grotesque is from Gothenburg. And I think House of Usher, I think they're from Gothenburg area or
near
area.
there. Yeah, but the majority of these bands, your Unleashed, Entombed, Dismember, Nirvana 2002, Cronic, Decay. A lot of these bands are, I think, from the near the Stockholm area.
I think
so it kind of is sort of the introduction to the world in many ways for a lot of those bands. Because outside of Entombed, I think at this point, Entombed was the only band that was signed on not really a major label, but at least a major label
underground. Yeah,
that would get in terms of introducing themselves to the American audience. This was probably one of the first things that would have done it, right?
This comp?
Yeah. Well, but it didn't have a lot of distribution either.
It's still, you even look it up online, and it's really hard to find any information about the thing at all. And I guess this was coming out at the same time as, the first Dismember record.
Like an overflowing stream.
But all this stuff was, it was, most of it was recorded in early 90.
Okay.
So a lot of it predates most of these bands' first records, except for, Merciless already had a record out. And,
Tiamat, I think, had put out maybe Sumerian Cry by this point.
Yeah.
In 1990. And Grotesque, I think, probably had maybe an EP or something that was
demos.
out.
And I think Treblinka, the precursor to Tiamat, I think they had a couple demos out before as well. Same with Therion.
Yep. But, in particular, this is, just unique in that nobody got a hold of this thing. Like you said, it's sort of a rarity, but yet the quality of bands on this thing is almost absurd. You don't see compilations like this anymore.
No, and a lot of these bands, I think, like House of Usher never put out a proper album.
I don't know if
Nirvana 2002.
Yeah,
they put out a couple demos.
Cronic Decay, I don't think put out anything in particular. So this is really one of the only places that you would have been able to find something. From some of these bands, and it's almost like the culmination of kind of the Swedish tape trading community. Put on one disc in a way. And if you read a recent book that just sort of came out that I know Mark and I have picked up and talked about before on this, the Swedish death metal book that Daniel Eckeroth put out, he talks about a lot of these sort of obscure bands that really sort of are the puzzle pieces of the whole Swedish death metal scene.
Yeah, one of the big ones that we actually have 2 tracks from is Merciless.
Merciless. And they're a band not many people I know are that terribly familiar with. They hardly get mentioned in by anyone.
I think they have maybe 2 records out that are still kind of available. They're probably in the $40 to $50 range. But.
Yeah, if you hunt around on eBay or Amazon, is that the one the first release on Euronymous' label? Is that one still
the DSP one?
Yeah, or is that one that's just almost?
Jeez, I can't even think. I should have done a little bit more pre-planning and remembered what the names.
Well,
of
yeah,
records
I can't remember. I mean, because the point of this was not to give a band history necessarily for every single band on this compilation, or else it'd be a 4-hour podcast. But again, to sort of spend a little bit of time with some of these bands is maybe some of you who are listening to this podcast for the first time haven't really explored the old sort of classic Swedish death metal scene. You might be familiar with you're At the Gates and maybe a Left Hand Path from Entombed and a couple other choice releases.
And even people hear Therion's name thrown around a lot now, and they're ever since Symphony Masses in, when was that, maybe 92 or 90?
I think it was 94.
Was it 94?
Yeah.
That that totally changed the direction of the band in some weird symphonic orchestrated death metal act. So,
and Tiamat the same. They've sort of become kind of gothic garbage.
Really, yeah. They put out 3 solid records and then just kind of what
fell
happened?
apart. Yep. And some of these bands, just like you said, never even put out any proper releases. And a lot of people who listen to At the Gates may not even know Grotesque.
Yeah, so the House of Usher connections with Martin Larson.
Martin from At the Gates, absolutely. So this is kind of, was one of our inspirations for why we wanted to do a show like this, was because, just the sheer value of all these bands, and it gave us an opportunity to talk about a scene that you were a really big part of, because it was sort of right when you were kind of getting into the extreme metal scene, and then I kind of picked up on the tail end of this scene a couple of years later.
I should mention that the CD and I've got the LP version of it here, and Jason's got a copy of the CD, and and the CD's actually got like, what, 4 or 5 bonus tracks?
Yeah, the Tiamat song we're going to play tonight, and one of the Merciless songs that we're going to play tonight, neither of which are on your LP, right? But I think Chris hooked us up with the CD version of this, which again, I don't know how readily available the CD version is anywhere.
I can't find anything online at all. I looked around to try to see if I could find just even there's like on the Metal Encyclopedia or Metal Archives, they've got like a mention of it. Yeah, but I haven't seen a whole lot of just versions of the CD or the LP anywhere.
And I mean, I don't even have the real CD. I just have a copy that was made back in college, I think off of you, which you made a copy, I think off of Chris.
Yeah.
So this is, when we talk about obscure compilations, we're talking pretty obscure. And actually on the back of your LP, doesn't it say how many copies this thing was limited to? Is it like 800 or something? I think when you pull it out in the sleeve, it said something about it, but it's pretty crazy. Yeah, you'll not find this anywhere. 800 copies.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean...
I'll hang on to this.
Yeah, exactly. Probably not something you want to, throw on eBay. It's a nice collector's item. So, that's why you're listening to our podcast, and is because you probably won't hear these songs anywhere else, or at least you may hear these songs, but maybe not these versions. Like the first song we just played, Entombed Forsaken. Entombed really is given credit for... along with maybe Treblinka, Bathory, Candlemass being sort of like one of the first kind of major, Swedish metal bands to get, I guess Nihilist came before Entombed, but, Forsaken is a good representation of that sort of first couple records of Entombed sound, the so-called Stockholm sound where everything is sort of turned up to, chaotic like 11 on the amps.
Basically.
I think the guy
all kind of a mistake.
Yeah, wasn't the guy given credit was Leaf, the guitar player for Nihilist.
Yep.
Yeah, he just sort of turned everything up probably to cover up the fact that he maybe wasn't that great of a guitar player.
Yeah, after everybody heard the Thomas Skogsberg recording of it, everybody tried to like mimic that sound. I think they even like got in contact with him, and he was living in Canada or something. Like, man, what were your settings on that pedal when you did that?
And he probably had no idea what he was doing when he first recorded some of that early stuff, and it was like an accidental discovery of this sort of like warm, deep bass, heavy, sort of thick sound, that's sort of come to define the Swedish scene, at least the Stockholm scene. Whereas those of you who remember hearing the War compilation, the Gothenburg scene was sort of built more around like melody and a lot of like melodic twin guitars, almost kind of like an extension of Iron Maiden.
Yeah, and you mentioned a lot in Eckroth's book is like the whole punk connection to this, at least the Stockholm Swedish death metal stuff is for like Entombed, probably not Unleashed as much.
Definitely Grotesque.
Yep, Grotesque, Nirvana 2002.
Chronic
Dismember.
Decay, because Chronic Decay became Dischange.
Yep.
Some of the members went on, and they were kind of a crust band in the mid-90s there. What was the name of that Dischange record?
Seeing, Feeling, Bleeding.
Yeah, I remember I had that cassette tape. So you said you still have it,
I've got it on CD, yeah.
So
I think it came out in maybe 93, 94 on Nuclear Blast.
Yeah, part of the diss genre, which we could do as a whole podcast, really. A diss podcast. But for those of you, because we sort of jumped into this, I'm Jason Hundy.
And I'm Mark Rudolph.
And hopefully you're joining us. I know we had to take last week off. There was a lot of kind of chaotic things happening.
Memorial Day.
Yeah,
or Labor Day, wasn't it?
We were so, yeah, exactly. We had to take Labor Day off, obviously. But I started back to school, and it was just too much chaos for Mark and I to kind of get together to do all this. So I think the last podcast we did were some of the Cabin in the Woods recordings, the infamous Cabin in the Wood recordings of Anthrax and Morbid Angel and Satyricon.
What was the last one we did? The last one was Anthrax, wasn't it?
So
and thank you to everybody that's gotten us comments back. We've got quite a few comments lately about the direction of the show. And just like people that are like happy to, hey man, I haven't heard Anthrax in 15 years. I went out and bought some of those records now. So that's really cool.
And it was one of the reasons, like we get some of this inspiration to do some of the stuff. Like the reason we did Anthrax was because we were in the same boat as the person who emailed us. Like we just, I think, got an itch to like buy like an old Anthrax record, and we just started listening to it, and we're like, oh, let's do a show. Like let's pick all this old stuff up. And I think the same thing kind of happened with one of the podcasts we're going to be doing in the future with Merciful Fate, where we just sort of ignored it for a long time, and then recently kind of got back into it. Yeah,
it's one of those bands that, you go from a historical standpoint, and they're so influential to so many people, but when you're a kid and you think that at least this is how I was. Like, I was so dead serious about all this stuff. It was so cool, and everything had to be so serious. When I heard King Diamond, I was like, this is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
But now going back and listening to it, I absolutely love this stuff.
Yep. So, but anyway, so thanks for joining us and sticking with us. And if, again, if you have more comments to send to us, shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. So, and hopefully you enjoy what we're about to kind of get into. Now, Entombed, launches the record both on vinyl and on the CD, and it's kind of the appropriate kind of flagship Swedish band, I think, to launch all that. But the next set we're kind of going to get into, there's a real diversity of different sort of sounds that are happening in here. There's a trio of bands that we're going to play, and one of them, maybe two of them, you're probably familiar with, which is Unleashed and Therion. And the other you may have heard of in kind of legendary circles, which is House of Usher. Now, I kind of missed the boat with Therion, because by the time I got into metal, Therion records were pretty like dumpy. They were kind of getting the classical opera stuff mixed in with it.
Yeah, I think I got into them. The first record I got was Of Darkness, which has absolutely
good
horrible
stuff.
cover on it. But yeah, it's really, really solid stuff.
And that's part of the sound of this song, Future Conscious, where it's not from Of Darkness, but it's in that sort of trio of records that they did early on, right?
Yeah.
So what sort of made Therion kind of stand out in your mind in terms of the Swedish death metal scene?
I mean, really, they're really stripped down sound wise, but musically they got quite a bit going on. But they didn't seem to be as influenced by like the whole like D-beat crust kind of stuff. It seemed to be more of like a weird mishmash of like Hellhammer, Candlemass.
Celtic Frost, for sure. Even more, I would say, and I remember reading some of the interviews with Christopher Johansson, like right when he was sort of transitioning to that more operatic sound. He was definitely way into like the Into Pandemonium kind of experimental Celtic Frost stuff.
Yeah.
Because most people,
a lot of people over.
Yeah, and I think he maybe took it justifiably way too far in terms of metal scene. But you got to give the guy credit, because Therion's actually kind of had their own success in like outside of the metal
Germany
world. Yeah, exactly. They're huge with like kind of the goth kind of industrial sort of
and
leather
for what
crowd.
they do, they're pretty good, but it gets completely ridiculous.
Yeah, it's not my thing, my flavor of choice, I guess. But this Future Conscious song actually features are there keyboards in this song, or was it in other songs that Therion was doing in some of these early releases?
I think this has a little bit on it, but it wasn't as brought to the forefront as it was on some of their later ones, where it was following every guitar line and vocal line. But
it was certainly one of the first Swedish death metal bands to add sort of those weird kind of atmospherics in there.
Yeah, I mean, Grotesque did that to some degree, but it was more like with weird vocal and guitar stuff.
And Therion, I mean, Christopher Johansson, or especially early in the scene, he's kind of notorious too, and the reason I bring this up is because Mayhem's on this compilation, is because he was one of the targets of the whole Norwegian black metal scene for a while too, and I can't remember the reasons for it or why, if he was like speaking out against it, but I just find it odd.
I think there's a lot of misunderstandings.
But I also find it odd that he's one of the first like death metal guys to sort of play with keyboards, and yet he's being attacked by like black metal guys. I mean, it almost seems like absurd in a way, Yeah,
I mean, you could almost trace back the symphonic black metal thing. It kind of splintered off at him too. So
absolutely. And House of Usher, the second band we're going to play from here, they've got a really unique sound. I mean, outside of the fact that, the drummer went on to be in Dischange, the crust band in the 90s. Famously, Martin Larsson went on and became the guitar player in At the Gates after With Fear. I think after the recording of With Fear. So he played on Terminal Spirit Disease and Slaughter of the Soul. And of course, now with the At the Gates reunion that's going on, he's actually on stage.
Yep.
And I remember I have sort of fond memories of Martin, because when I saw him back in high school, when we saw At the Gates and Napalm, and I think I've said this before on podcasts, we actually went to Wendy's with him. So that's my House of Usher connection.
He's a real kind of sweet, soft-spoken guy.
Yeah, he seems like the most down-to-earth guy maybe in the whole band. But in terms of sounds,
House of Usher is incredibly bass heavy.
Yeah,
it has a lot of real stop-start staccato progressive elements going on too.
And I'd say there's like a doomy kind of you said kind of the British doom kind of sound that's happening there. But I would imagine too, because of the era we're talking about, they probably had some roots in like the Swedish Candlemass kind of doom metal sound.
I'm not as familiar with Candlemasses. I don't think I own anything.
Yeah, and I've sort of recently kind of done what I did with Anthrax, where I just went and bought all the old Candlemass and you'll probably be hearing a Candlemass thing.
Well, it's nice
probably in
after
the
this
future.
stuff's like, 20-some years old, going back with all the historical relevance and like, man, this stuff is way better than...
And his vocals in Candlemass, like Merciful Fate that you mentioned before, like you can kind of like hear him in a new light where you're not
if
like
you grew up in,
uptight and embarrassed.
Yeah, if you grew up with Iron Maiden and Priest, I'm sure it would have been different. But, because the era of Maiden I grew up with was like Dickinson, like Power Slave kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it was way different.
Yeah. So, but anyways, not to get too much on the Candlemass, but the sound is very, has kind of a Candlemass kind of thing going on it. And in this particular song called Battle of Spectrum, which again, I don't know if this song I don't know where the song ever turned up, if it was on anything else besides Projections, maybe a demo. But this song in particular, you'll hear when we play it, has a real death kind of sound going on. I notice almost kind of a riff lifted almost right off of Zombie Ritual, which was from Scream Bloody Gore. So, I mean, obviously Death and Possess and all those bands are going to play like a huge, influence on a lot of the early death metal, because that was the only thing these guys had listened to, so they're going to be kind of mocking that a little bit. So, and then, like you said, the real progressive kind of sound that was going on, the At the Gates kind of really, got into with At the, Red in the Sky Is Ours, that sort of, like you said, stop-start kind of thing happening. And then we're going to get into some Unleashed, but we'll talk about Unleashed maybe when we come back after this trio of songs. So we're going to get into Therion's Future Conscious, House of Usher, Battle of Spectrum, and Unleashed the Dark One. And all three of these, like we said, can be found on the Projections of a Stained Mind compilation.
Too far.
That was Unleashed, the Dark One. And before that, of course, House of Usher and Therion. And Unleashed, the Dark One, that song can also be found on their debut record, correct?
Yep. And I'm drawing a blank.
Where No Life Dwells, of course, which was put out by Century Media back in '91. And you noticed a difference between this and the version on this right away, and we were kind of like, oh, what is it? And then you're kind of flipping through the LP, and what was the sort of weird
Apparently,
vocal discovery there?
Yeah, Robin, a guitarist, I don't even believe he's on that record. I think it's
not for sure. I
think Thomas and
Frederick, Johnny, Thomas, and Anders.
Yeah, so he must have just been on like the first demo era Unleashed stuff. But yeah, apparently he did vocals on that track.
And that's kind of odd because Johnny always does vocals from forever, right? Mm-hmm. Pretty much, So kind of a unique version, just like the Entombed Forsaken in terms of vocals.
Yeah, and this one was recorded live in the studio in April of '90. So
April of '90, and I'm going to look and see when
that's probably right after, several months after he was booted out of, or they basically quit Nihilist because they're too scared to tell him that he wasn't in the band anymore.
Yeah, because that's where Johnny got his start. He was the bass player?
Yeah, and I think he's a fair number of years older than a lot of the guys in the scene too, so I think he'd been around in other bands. I'm not really sure which, but if any of this kind of like history, grabs you, definitely go and get that Swedish Death Metal book.
For sure, that's almost encyclopedic.
You can get it on bazillionpoints.com for about $35 postpaid, and it's a phone book.
It's 500 pages. It's nice.
It's got like a really nice glossary in the back of both magazines and every single Swedish band you can imagine from from like 87 all the way up to something
95
like 95
or something
96.
Like that. Yeah, so sort of the glory years, and it's just got a nice collection of like all the major fanzines and magazines from Sweden. It's got a lot of the old like kind of posters for the bands, the little inserts and stuff. Every
demo cover, flyers from shows. I mean, it's written from like kind of an interview documentarian kind of way. So it's not. I mean, the author definitely puts his opinion out there on things, and there's a little bit of translation loss with the writing, but it's a really interesting book.
And it's funny, the Dark One, actually, I'm looking at the CD here, and it says that song was originally kind of written by Johnny in December of '89, so that's maybe the first Unleashed song, and that's maybe why they chose to put it on this Projections of a Stained Mind comp. Yeah. But it's a cool version. It's obviously less produced in some ways, a little raw.
The drums are way more interesting on the album version too.
Sure. It's just, this is more like sort of the brutal kind of, kick your butt sort of version. But
on Unleashed, they seem to pull more of their influence from new wave of British heavy metal stuff and Venom and that era more so than the punk roots.
Absolutely, it's a Celtic Frost kind of doomier thing. They always seem slower to me than Dismember and Entombed.
Yeah, they were. I mean, they did a lot of going back and forth, but when it was like full out blast, there wasn't a whole lot of like harmony going on. It was just kind of like in your face.
More primitive almost, which kind of gets into what, vocally where they're kind of coming from with this whole kind of pagan Viking theme that was always like really prevalent in a lot of Unleashed.
And outside of like Bloodfire Death Battery that I know of, there wasn't a ton of other bands that were totally jumping on this Viking thing.
Sure,
this is kind of Amon Amarth before Amon Amarth. People are probably pretty familiar with them now as being Viking metal band. But.
Yeah, and Enslaved, which we've done podcasts on before as well. So Unleashed is a band like I think the first Unleashed thing I ever heard was the Victory record, and it turned me off from Unleashed for a real long time, and then I finally went back and bought their first 3 records in like the last 5 or 6 years, and of course kicked myself for not having those a long time ago. But it was hard because you hear Victory and I'm like, I'm not really interested in what this band may have sounded like, even though people like you or Chris would be like, no, seriously, Unleashed old stuff was really killer.
The Unleashed Where No Life Dwells, Grave Into the Grave, and the first Tiamat record. Both, that was like the first wave of Century Media along with Morgoth. And that stuff was just like absolutely beautiful production values on the CDs themselves, and
they had that nice really silver tone that they did on the back of all those. I remember it was like
the Graves, kind of like a goldish kind of color going on. The Morgoth as well,
and Asphyx was Century Media as well. So that golden era. Old Iced Earth. Just kidding. That first Iced Earth is hard to get through. Whoa. But that's I have what was I going to say? My other early memory of Unleashed is whatever song was on the first Identity comp, which I think was something from the Victory record. because that Identity comp was like the first like introduction to Century Media for me, because I had like Grave Solus era, Tiamat Wild Honey era, so it was like right after you guys.
Well, yeah, and Unleash is one of those bands that they put out 3 good records and like 3 to 4 crap records, and then they came back and put out like 3 fantastic records.
The recent stuff is awesome, for sure.
A lot of these guys that finally like returned to form, like realized what got them into this in the first place, can manage to capture that, unlike a lot of other bands out there.
And of course, if you're a historical person, because of all the roots, the fact that they're part of the Nihilist, which was part of Entombed, which was part of this whole nucleus of Swedish heavy metal and Swedish metal. So, and now we're going to kind of change gears a little bit and kind of get out of sort of the more traditional Stockholm Swedish metal kind of sound into almost a band that's almost pure thrash in a way. That's Merciless. And we were talking earlier about how Merciless is one of the few bands on this compilation outside of Dismember, Unleashed, and Entombed that actually has a couple of records out there that you can, if you're lucky, track down and buy. But at least you can.
They're incredibly expensive.
But they're out there. They exist on some level, And the first release that Euronymous put out on his Death Like Silence production was a Merciless record. Ironically, it had nothing to do with black metal at all.
That's before all the trueness. And
exactly. Cult. Yeah. But
Merciless definitely come from that kind of threat. I mean, they're probably the most competent players on any out of this entire compilation. I think they're absolutely fantastic players, and it really comes through as far as songwriting and everything goes. But they definitely had that a lot of the German thrash stuff.
You heard a lot of Creator and Sodom and Destruction for sure. And I was picking up that they also had this great kind of it was like a balance between German and American thrash in a way.
Yeah, a lot of those like almost Exodus style breakdowns and stuff too.
Some Kill 'Em All, like Search and Destroy kind of Metallica movements. And then even a band that I've sort of recently gone back and kind of listened to, and I know you haven't quite done that yet, is Sadus. And Sadus, like Creator, kind of toe that line between death metal and thrash metal with the vocal styles and some of that kind of stuff. And obviously when you hear these Merciless songs, it's not clean Metallica singing, it's definitely a death,
it's more of a
death
Creator
metal
sound
stuff.
And
Nuclear Attack and Book of Lies are just a pairing of songs that are, it makes me just want to be able to like get a hold of some of that other Merciless stuff. It really is sort of frustrating that it's not more readily available, that nobody's reissued it or anything like that.
It's really surprising they never made many waves either. I mean, I think by the time their stuff actually got out there's so much other stuff going on that everybody just kind of forgot about them.
Well, and I think they get caught in the same realm that I think Sadus got caught in that they started to blossom in the early 90s when nobody really cared about thrash anymore. Everybody was either turning to grunge on the American front, or you were going overseas or going to Florida. You're looking at like death metal in Sweden or black metal in Norway, or you were looking at like the Florida death metal stuff. And it's like almost any great thrash metal record that was put out between like 1990 and 1992 like gets almost lost in the shuffle, unless we're talking Rust in Peace or Seasons in the Abyss, So I don't know. So I feel like maybe they just were doing the wrong kind of style at the wrong time or something like that. And like now there's this huge like sort of thrash revival that's going on in the 2000s, and most of it's kind of crappy, but there's a few that are kind of cool, or at least fun. A lot Dave Whitty's new band, I forget, Municipal Waste is kind of cool.
Toxic Holocaust, and I mean a lot of it seems to be more nostalgic throwback with. I mean, the guys just dress up like fools. It seems. I don't know how much of it's. I don't know.
I would imagine. I feel like Municipal Waste has there's like kind of a honesty there, but they a lot of those guys have process it through a punk attitude more. It's like a minute and a half songs. Everything, but
almost like what Pig Destroyer does throwing all those thrash breakdowns and stuff.
Absolutely. But what were you gonna say about you feel like?
These guys a lot of these anytime these things come back, it always. I don't know. Not a whole lot of the bands that actually started this stuff seem to get a whole lot of credit. It always bugs me for being an old cuss, but. I mean, it's the same way with, when the whole hardcore thing started again. Like, nobody knew who At the Gates was, but all this stuff was ripped off from At the Gates. So it's just me being an old cuss.
Yeah, that's all right. So let's get into some Merciless here. We're going to hear Nuclear Attack and Book of Lies, and in particular pay attention to the awesome sort of groove that Book of Lies sort of ends with, kind of like a minute of instrumental kind of thrashing out. It's pretty cool stuff. All right, that was Tiamat, Ancient Entity, preceded by a couple of Merciless songs that we just talked about in the last set, Nuclear Attack and Book of Lies. And, kind of a weird transition there from, sort of balls to the walls,
Yeah, you're just saying you heard some Accept.
Yeah,
too,
Witchery kind
sense.
of almost does that sort of sound today, that Merciless does, sort of that throwback retro thrash kind of thing.
Or even Satanic Slaughter has that same kind of sound.
Witchery.
Makes sense, yeah.
They were
guys from Seance. And
Yep. And but Tiamat is a totally different direction, and they're a band historically given credit, as we mentioned before, either in their Tiamat incarnation or the previous band, Treblinka. I was going to say Sri Lanka, which is like a film festival.
The worst name you could ever have for a band. Named after
I don't even know what it means.
Camp.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah.
Oh, gee. Oh, yeah, Treblinka. I should know that. I'm a history.
Yeah. So I think that was just kind of naivete at their, being young kids and thinking, being like drawn to that kind of stuff. They even mentioned in the Swedish Death Metal book a little bit that they just kind of, everybody was like, man, why can you have that name? They're like, no, it's cool.
Well, so they go from a concentration camp to a Sumerian god or a Babylonian god, Tiamat,
Or if you're big into D&D,
Yeah, that's true.
The cartoon.
True. Yeah. But Ancient Entity, this shows up on their first kind of full-length Astral Sleep. And it was, even when I bought Astral Sleep, before I knew anything really about Tiamat, I think I found it used at New Moon Records after I bought Wild Honey. So I had Wild Honey, and then I got Astral Sleep, and then I got Clouds last. Kind of weird way of doing things, but that song always jumped out to me as being kind of the centerpiece of that whole record. It's
not Lady Temptress.
Yeah, I don't know. Mountains of Doom was a pretty cool tune as well, but for some reason that Ancient Entity just had like all these like different movements to it.
And this version actually has, if you listen to the album version, it's kind of straight, and this one between like every kind of like
there's some flying leads and kind of
every time
there's
anything kind of quiets down a little bit in between riffs, they just throw out these little flurry of notes. I think it sounds awesome, but
it's kind of like a new wave of British heavy metal kind of approach to it too.
With just like almost just some hard rock and like blues influences almost put in there. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, but in terms of like being as far away from Merciless as possible, Tiamat's probably it on this compilation. Maybe Mayhem might be pretty far away too, but very doomy. Like we said earlier, probably a massive Candlemass influence. Massive Candlemass, that's ridiculous. I'm sorry for that. And also a lot of Celtic Frost, Hellhammer stuff. But in particular, you mentioned, like we said with Therion, the Into the Pandemonium record.
Yeah.
And that record, Celtic Frost, I don't think got the proper due credit for it. When it came out in '87, because
it was ahead of its time.
People really wanted to hear more of that sort of, Morbid Tales, to make a Therion kind of sound.
Return stuff.
And Into the Pandemonium had like these sort of operatic kind of things happening. They did the cover of the Walls of Voodoo song, Mexican Radio. It was a weird record, and obviously I wasn't listening to extreme metal in '87, so I can't really understand what the reaction would have been. But
it was kind of, if you look back at things, it's almost like a singularity. I don't remember hearing anything else that was anywhere close to doing that kind of stuff. It's just kind of like completely wacky for that era.
And I think, Celtic Frost obviously at that time were trying to like kind of spread their wings and do some other stuff. And of course, their next step was a huge misstep. Of course, the
step right into Cold Lake.
Yeah, the infamous Cold Lake, which has become metaphorical for crappy experimental album. It's almost become
referred to as whoever's Cold Lake.
Yeah. Gosh. But anyways, back to Tiamat, they really took some of the experimentation, I think, of Into the Pandemonium, maybe the slower, doomier kind of stuff. And
even vocally, out of any other vocalist on this record, he's got really interesting things going on. It's not as gruff, it's more of like kind of screamed, and he's got a fairly deep voice anyway, so it has more inflection to it, I think, than a lot of the guys on here.
And the person we're talking about is sort of the band leader of Tiamat, and that's Johan Edlund, and just a really talented, creative, visionary force in the whole Swedish death metal scene.
Well, you look at each one of their first 3 records, each is a different style almost.
And, whereas this is sort of got kind of the Celtic Frost, kind of doom and gloom. It's got a little bit of sort of the Therion.
It's got a little bit of 70s
keyboards,
rock in it as well. Very under the radar. That kind of shows up more in Wild Honey.
Yeah, but then like Clouds, the next record, is almost like atmospheric doom the whole way. And then Wild Honey is like this sort of psychedelic Pink Floyd Odyssey sort of channeled through death metal.
Super powerful, a lot of major chords. It's almost like triumphant sounding record.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Whatever That Hurts might be the song that single-handedly like dragged me into Swedish metal. I mean, that's
it's a fantastic track.
That's when I met Chris, was I went into New Moon to order that from New Moon Records, and that's, the rest is history, as we've kind of talked about before. But Ancient Entity, I also heard some other things, like they almost kind of did, because of the Celtic Frost sound that they sort of have, and that sort of Celtic Frost sort of groove crunch kind of thing. There was also a part on there, and you and I both picked it up, sounded just like Obituary, Cause of Death, with James Murphy kind of throwing some of the leads and stuff over that. So Tiamat, a really, really cool band, and they're a band, if you as a listener haven't really checked anything out by them, definitely recommend Astro Sleep, Clouds, and Wild Honey. And even myself, and I know Chris, we kind of are into the record they'd made after that, Deeper Kind of Slumber.
Which it's about half and half good, I think. It was a little bit too experimental for its time, or for their experience level.
Sure. And I think they, that was like in the era when like Moonspell was starting to kind of get into that sound as well. And so there was all these
Cemetery
bands
was doing that, like Lake of Tears, all these bands were kind of like
doing the gothic rock kind of thing.
Yeah.
And Tiamat, unfortunately, as we mentioned earlier,
never came back.
Yeah, they've gone off the deep end. So, but this is a classic era of Tiamat, and a good representation of sort of the best of their sound. And where we're going next is actually, kind of to the beginning birth pains of a band that was going to really just shake the foundations of all of Swedish metal, almost as much as Entombed did, and that's At the Gates. But in this first kind of early incarnation of what some of the roots of At the Gates would be, we're talking about Grotesque.
We've got Christian Wallen and Thomas Lindberg.
Yeah, I think Elf was in Grotesque as well, wasn't he?
Yeah, I don't know if he's on this or
Elf
not.
Svensson?
But
I know he's in some versions of it.
He is on this song, yeah.
Okay. And so Elf, if you remember the podcast we did with Albert, Albert and Chris, I think both really attribute a lot of the early sound of At the Gates to the sensibilities that Elf kind of brought to the band. And then, of course, when he quit, Martin Larson came in from House of Usher that you heard earlier. And the brothers kind of took over the songwriting, and it kind of became more of a thrashy sound.
Christian Wallen almost took Grotesque to the next level with Liars and Wait, too.
Yeah, and they're a band that you can actually still get their stuff.
You can get their EP for $5 on Amazon. Yeah. Really, really solid stuff. It's almost a mix between Grotesque and Merciless kind of sound and
stuff. Very thrashy then, too.
Yeah.
And Grotesque, we were trying to figure out you're going to hear it in a second, but the sample that this comes from, we think maybe The Exorcist, but we can't exactly pinpoint it. But the name of the song is called Spawn of Azithoth, and this is on the Grotesque record. Is it the In the Embrace of Evil? Isn't that what it's called? That you can get nowadays, and I think it's even packaged with the first At the Gates EP.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, that's my version. Has that now?
Okay, because I've got the
digipack.
The digipack that's got the 2 demos and stuff on it as well,
and the picture of Thomas,
Doom and
with the sunglasses on and stuff.
Yeah.
Those look like child molester photos or something of him and Kristen Wallen, Necrolord, and
what was it?
I can't remember what he
Goat Spawn or something?
Goat Spawn or Goat Snake, or not Goat Snake.
Grotesque always seem they're like one of the most like scary kind of bands when you're a young kid, like looking at this stuff. They just seemed like completely like crazy.
Serious about it.
Yeah.
But then now, once you read some interviews with Thomas, there's no way you could ever take these guys completely seriously. He's like the nicest guy in the world. But Grotesque was coming out of a different place, even though there are some kind of like Entombed riffs that you hear in here. You're also hearing a lot more hardcore crust punk stuff, which Thomas was really into, and you're also hearing a lot more like Slayer. I mean, just pure like old sort of Rain and Blood, or even prior Hell Awaits kind of Slayer riffs, mixed in with some of the like Destruction leads and Creator leads and stuff. But you know, Grotesque had a huge influence on the scene, and you know, I mean, this is a really kick butt song to kind of represent them, and you know, again, I think you're getting a sense of, you know, how much history is just on this freaking record. I mean, this is like the history of the Swedish metal scene.
It should almost accompany the Swedish Death Metal book.
Exactly. It should have come with a free copy. Daniel, if you're listening, you know, if you do another print run of these, you know.
Well, hopefully that'll spark a little bit more interest in getting some of those old forgotten demos repressed onto CD.
Maybe Merciless and House of Usher and some of that stuff.
I'd love to see that stuff come out again.
It'd be great to have, like, you know, my own personal copy of it rather than, you know, downloads and burns and all this other kind of stuff. So, but let's hear some Grotesque, and then we're going to follow that up with a Dismember and a Nirvana 2002 song, but we'll talk about those when we come back. So enjoy Spawn of the Azithoth, or Azithoth. that was Nirvana 2002 with a tune called Mourning, Dismember, Sickening Art, and, of course, Grotesque. Now, Dismember, we've explored in pretty thorough...
we did a whole episode. I think it was like our second or third episode.
Yeah,
we did,
so, I mean, we don't have to get a terrible amount into Dismember, but this, you did notice, was a slightly different version than the version you can find on, like, an overflowing stream.
Yeah, I think it's a demo version. That it's not... The guitars aren't quite as razor sharp as they are on, like, an overflowing stream. I think the vocal seems significantly different, too,
but a great representation. Again, if you just now are listening to our podcast and haven't gone back and heard some of the early podcasts we did, if you in particular really dug that style of sound that you heard from either Dismember or Nirvana 2002, that really sort of crunchy, thick, just
really
bludgeoning, you should definitely go back and listen to the Dismember show we did, because we'll talk all about their history there. So. But
we mentioned a little bit of Nirvana 2002's history as far as the singer being on the Entombed Crawl EP, and he's gone on to be one of the bigger kind of film journalists in Sweden too, which is kind of cool.
I think he has like a Siskel and Ebert type show there in Sweden or something like that, or he's something like that. I remember reading like a TV show on Swedish television.
Yeah.
So that's kind of odd, and
actually they just reunited. I think in 2005 they did some live shows and they reissued. I think they reissued one of their EPs or something.
Well, I know Mourning is the name of one of their either EPs or demos, which is the song that we just played. So I don't know if that could have been the one, or maybe one that sort of followed. I know they did have a handful of sort of things, but they, Nirvana 2002, like, to me, you could fool someone and play that song and tell somebody it was old Entombed or Dismember. Yeah. It's that close to
Yeah, I mean, they had slightly different vocals. I think their production was a little bit warmer than Entombed's, a little bit more organic sounding. But as far as riffs and song structures, man, they're pretty darn close.
Well, they had several demos here, some rehearsal tapes and things like that. It looks like I don't know if they ever actually put out an album. And in fact,
I don't think they did. I think it was all demos.
It was just all demo stuff.
Yeah.
So who knows what just
tapes.
got released? Yeah, it was all these rehearsal tapes and stuff. But of course, strange name, Nirvana 2002, and we should probably mention that they originally were called Nirvana in 1989. But of course, I think maybe someone, an attorney of some sort, maybe issued a lawsuit.
Nirvana was starting to get pretty popular at the time, so they probably wanted to distance themselves.
Yeah, associate.
And I always thought Nirvana 2002 was kind of a cool name. I had no idea where it came from when I was younger. I was just like, oh, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I guess now that it's beyond 2002, maybe it lacks some of that punch that it used to have. But really great stuff. And I think these two are almost like kind of a litmus test for Swedish death metal. Like, you just, if you wanted to know what it was, that's what you would do. But our last set that we're going to kind of get into is a really interesting mixture of things, because it's almost surprising that this band made it onto the Projections of the Stained Mind, in retrospect. At this point, the history isn't really behind Mayhem, because Dead is still singing for them. Euronymous is still playing guitar. There's no controversy. There's no scandal.
Church burnings, nothing.
Yeah, no suicides, murders, all that sort of stuff. So maybe at the time it was just like, hey, these are another extreme metal band, even though they're from Norway.
Euronymous, guitarist in Mayhem, was like huge into the tape trading scene, like worldwide. So I'm sure he was kind of like, well, hey.
And I'm sure that's how he got hooked up with Merciless, as being the first band that he put out on his little label in Norway there. So... But this is the tune Carnage, which, some people are probably familiar with. I don't know if this version is the only version or only place you can hear this particular version, or if it shows up on any of their sort of early releases.
Yeah, but they've got a handful of 7 inches. There's the Live in Leipzig. I'm sure it's on that.
I know Carnage is on Live in Leipzig, but this particular version, for those of you who are old school black metal fans, may be kind of a tasty treat, in a way. Again, my Mayhem knowledge, I apologize, is fairly limited, because
I think if you have Live in Leipzig, De Mysterious, you're set.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned. But, a lot of the newer stuff has just not really been up to snuff. And the guys have such egos anymore, and nobody's left in the band except... Hellhammer's not even in the band anymore, is he?
No, I think he is.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure Hellhammer is. And Necro Butcher, who you'll hear on bass, is in the band. But I think he left after this era. And Burzum came in. Well, not Burzum, but Grishnak.
Grishnak,
came in and played bass, I think, on some of the stuff for a while. And
Not that it matters on the recordings, but
Yeah, exactly. You can't hear any bass. So, but Carnage is cool. This tune in particular is really strange because it doesn't have some of the really weird atmospheric kind of
the strumming
evil
stuff.
Yeah, black metal sort of sound. In fact, Freezy
like
Moon's
the
on
Tormentor
here.
sound stuff. Yeah,
Yeah, Freezy Moon is on this compilation as well. But we figured, well, everybody knows Freezy Moon, so let's throw out Carnage because Carnage in a way fits more with the Swedish
it's got
stuff
more of
that
a
we're
punk
doing.
edge to it, I think.
Yeah, and the drums, the drums are awesome on this. Like,
They're actually produced really well too. You can actually hear like the kick is just going crazy. And he's doing like a shuffle on the hi hat and get like a really like sweet groove going on.
yeah, it's like Pete Sandoval stuff on like Terrorizer and old Morbid Angel records almost. That sort of raw, cool groove sound.
Drop the vocals and the guitar on it. It's still cool just to listen to the drums.
It almost works as an instrumental because, you know, like Dead comes in and like screams something like a couple times in the song, but it's almost completely Carnage. You know, it's just like a Carnage instrumental, you know. But it's a cool tune. And then those of you who maybe have dismissed black metal or the controversy surrounding Mayhem, this may kind of give you a different perspective. And then we're going to kind of close things out tonight with Chronic Decay in the 1st of September, which we have no idea what that's a reference to at all. But Chronic Decay, kind of a cool band. They eventually became Dischange.
Yeah, and this was off their 7-inch. I believe it might have been the only thing they put out.
Yeah, and we were commenting that
Ecstasy and Pain 7-inch.
Is that what it was? Okay.
Yeah.
And kind of commenting that there's a real big Possessed death metal, the song in particular, death metal that Possessed wrote. I almost kind of like hear some of the melodies and some of the vocal lines in this tune, and as well as kind of this thrashy crust edge that you know and you
really,
were picking up
really
on.
solid drumming too. His balls out drumming.
And vocally, we were kind of mixed between. I was hearing some kind of Mike Browning, old Morbid Angel vocals, and you were hearing like old Bolt Thrower kind of stuff.
Yeah, even like a little bit of like the first era of David Vincent a little bit, but a little bit on higher register.
Yeah. So pretty cool stuff. So, anyways, we hope you've really enjoyed listening to, I guess, essentially a history of Swedish death metal, but it's all on this Projections of the Stained Mind. Yeah, from 1990, 1991. And this is a wonderful introduction for those of you who are new to all this whole scene, and hopefully you enjoyed it. And in particular, if you liked any of these bands a whole lot and would like to hear more from them, from us, shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com and let us know. Like if you want to hear a Tiamat show or Unleash show, or we haven't done an Entombed show yet. I mean, we're always up for it. We aim to please. So. Yeah, but let us know what you think, and hopefully keep listening, right? So
that's for sure.
For Mark Rudolph. Yeah, we're exchanging names today. For Jason Hundy
and Mark Rudolph.
Enjoy.
mercy.